Hi, everyone. Welcome back from lunch. We're going to start session number 3 now, which is focused on the collectively improving the discipline of socioeconomic impact assessment. So we have a number of speakers here and virtually as well. So bear with us for some of the virtual attendees. But today you're going to be hearing from Holly first. And supported by Cole, who will be available for questions, I understand, virtually. And then you'll also hear from Marion Tibor McMahon and Leslie Spence, as well as Sarah, I'm going to pronounce it incorrect, so I apologize, Dugian, Shayna Siegel, and then Leanna Augustine and Nathan Snyder. So similar to what we did previously this morning, if you want to just hold the questions until the end, just jot those down and we can have a conversation then, okay? So at this point, I'd like to call upon Holly.
Hi everyone, welcome. My name is Holly Campbell-Gale. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Regina, and for the past 2 years have worked as a research assistant on a project about gender-based analysis plus in Canada's impact assessment process, which is what I'll be sharing with you today. The lead researchers on this project are Dr. Amber Fletcher and Dr. Cole Atland, who's going to be joining us remotely. And just a little bit about me, my PhD project is on the social dimensions of climate change, particularly adaptive capacity in rural and small town prairie communities. Also, as a shameless plug, my PhD work is nearing completion, and through the course of it, I've discovered my true passion and gifting seems to be knowledge translation and offering writing and editing support throughout research processes and projects to help make research more accessible. So if anyone's thinking of expanding their team accordingly, please come find me after. Yeah. Now, which button do we press exactly? Press each one and see what happens. Oh, there we go. And before we proceed, I would just like to thank the sponsors for our project. So I'd like to thank NEDIA, the Network for Expertise and Dialogue for Impact Assessment, which connects academics, practitioners, and communities, the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, and of course, the Social Science and Humanities Research Council, acknowledging that this project is supported in part by funding from these sources. So our project initially set out to do two things. First, we intended to examine the structural forces and practical limitations affecting the implementation of gender-based analysis plus in the Canadian impact assessment sector. So we wanted to know what are the challenges surrounding GBA plus implementation. And secondly, we wanted to use that knowledge to develop practical outputs in order to address the challenges we found surrounding gender-based analysis plus in the impact assessment sector. So as far as those practical outputs, we're in the process of writing 3 papers. The first paper is a look at gender-based analysis within the legislation process, specifically for Canada's Impact Assessment Act in 2019. We do an in-depth review of how gender-based analysis was considered throughout the process of legislating the Act. Then for our second paper, these data are then contrasted with empirical findings from a review of past impact assessments. We look at 5 iconic cases that we identify as sustainability assessments, analyzing how gender-based analysis has been discussed and considered as part of the impact assessment process itself. And finally, for our third paper, the integration of gender-based analysis into sustainability assessment is applied theoretically to a case study in Northern Ontario. Discussing the concept of sustainability assessment in greater depth, we expand sustainability criteria to include gender, then applying these expanded criteria to well-being indicators co-created with the First Nations community in Northern Ontario's Ring of Fire. So for our first paper, as I mentioned, it looks at how gender-based analysis was discussed during the legislative process of the Impact Assessment Act of 2019. The Impact Assessment Act, a component of Bill C-69, was the first version of this policy to include gender-based analysis plus as a required consideration for impact assessments. During the legislation process for this act, the Canadian Senate undertook an unprecedented cross-Canada review, which generated hundreds of testimonies for and against this legislation. Our paper looks at how GBA Plus was considered during this process and the discourses at play. What sorts of issues were identified as problems and how were these framed? Guided by these ideas, we performed a feminist content analysis and critical frame analysis. We began with a basic frequency count for gender-related keywords on the full population of Bill C-69 legislation documents. Each document containing a keyword was divided into relevant excerpts and then coded in context. So this is the list of keywords that we use. Out of 149 documents surveyed, 56 contained these keywords and comprised our data set. These 56 documents were analyzed for gender content and 127 excerpts were found. So as I said, we're interested in how problems around gender-based analysis plus are framed. The first frame we came up with was related to scope and what is the appropriate scope for gender-based analysis, for impact assessment. Opponents to the Impact Assessment Act often argued that gender-based analysis plus is beyond the scope of impact assessment and does not belong in this legislation. In this framing, GBA plus is positioned as a social concern in contrast to the technical focus that should be the domain of impact assessment. We observed binary discourses of social versus technical concerns, as well as subjective versus objective. However, advocates argued that as the impacts of projects are in fact social, an expansion of scope, particularly one that recognizes gender, is needed in order to fully capture the experienced realities of projects. Another frame that we came up with had to do with equality and vulnerability. So some opponents of the bill argued that the emphasis on gender-based analysis was unjust to men, demonizing male workers in projects, and, to quote one senator, tarring the industry and resource sector with toxic masculinity when they're doing so much good work in communities. Advocates, however, brought forth data on the negative impacts of development projects on women, girls, and other marginalized groups. The data often discussed impacts such as violence against women and girls, substance abuse, erosion of traditional practices, and food and housing insecurity. Many advocated that gender-based analysis plus is simply a human right, although at times some senators seem to advocate for gender equity, mostly as a means of avoiding litigation and speeding up the approval process. So there were more frames than these in this project. These are preliminary conclusions, but a common thread we found throughout all of our frames was a sense of confusion, uncertainty, and lack of clarity. Many opponents were outright dismissive of GBA plus because it was considered to be so unclear, causing difficulty to industry proponents and developers, but also because of its potential to cause legal issues. Many supporters also argued that more clarity and guidelines are needed in order to help ensure that GBA plus is done effectively and meaningfully. We've also been reflecting throughout the course of this paper on assumptions made about women within this discourse. We find that within the impact assessment dialogue, women, especially Indigenous women, tend to be portrayed as vulnerable, as victims within resource development projects. Limited attention was given to women and gender diverse people as leaders with knowledge and agency. So that's the first paper we've been working on. The second paper, more focused on empiricism, has to do with past impact assessment processes. So given the concerns we just discussed about lack of clarity surrounding GBA plus, we decided to look at what actually is the precedent for gender-based analysis plus throughout the impact assessment process. How has it been included in past assessments? So this paper looks at a series of exemplary cases we've identified as sustainability assessments to explore how gender has been considered. What can past projects teach us about gender-based analysis plus, and how can that be applied to current and future cases? By using a series of gender-related keywords, once again, and examining the surrounding context, much as we did in the previous paper, we find that including gender-based analysis in impact assessment is not new, and that there does in fact exist precedent in previous assessments. So we came up with a list of criteria for what we term sustainability assessments. We are drawing on Gibson et al.'s concept, in which he argues that sustainability assessment takes a step beyond environmental assessment by aiming not only to support projects in reducing harm, but to support projects to increase net benefits for all involved, including surrounding communities. So we used the Federal Search Registry database to search for sustainability assessments and came up with a list of 5, which you see here on the slide. Then we used a list of keywords to assess how gender and gender-related words and phrases were taken up in each of the cases, using this tool here, which is way less visible than I thought it would be, so I apologize. The color coding system is relevant because we ranked the relevance for gender-based analysis based on a color code, so the darkest ones are the ones that are most relevant. maybe you could see all of this when the paper's published. So this is the least published of our 3 papers, or least developed rather. So the findings here are very preliminary. However, based on our list of codes, here are some themes that showed up across all 5 cases in a significant way. So concerns about worker influx tended to include concerns about having potentially several thousand workers transported in for a project and the impacts that might have on surrounding communities. The specific themes being the increased presence of alcohol, heightened risks of sexual assault, and disruption of local culture, generally Indigenous culture. The second significant theme here is around equitable employment, proponents' concerns about finding ways to hire women or share economic benefits with women. Secondary impacts tended to include things like the strain on the healthcare system, or even ripple effects like increased use of women's shelters in neighboring communities or even neighboring provinces and territories. And then finally, recommendations for how to integrate greater gender-based analysis into projects tended to include things like increased elder care and childcare options, better training for women, and collaboration with local First Nation bands to develop training materials specifically for Indigenous women. As I said, these findings are preliminary, so we expect to find many more recommendations, which we will be diving into within the paper. One interesting thing to note is the evolution of gender-based analysis throughout these cases. As you saw from the list of cases we've chosen, the first case we reviewed came from 1977. So the word gender wasn't used very often, and sometimes the tone was more than a little patronizing. But it is very clear that in most of these exemplary essay cases, the concerns we now identify as gender-based analysis plus were extremely present. In the midst of claims that there is no clarity and limited precedent, these cases demonstrate clear and tangible ways that gender-based analysis was in fact considered. So the final paper that we've been working on is a theoretical application of gender-based analysis plus into sustainability assessment. In this paper, we dig deep into the concept of sustainability assessment, which, as I said earlier, goes beyond the use of assessments to reduce harm, but instead aims to facilitate flourishing in the midst of projects. Sustainability assessment is still relatively new and is still very new to including explicit gender consideration. In the previous paper, we retroactively identified 5 past cases as sustainability assessments, but to explicitly design a sustainability assessment that includes gender considerations is akin to a brand new field. So this paper is a practical proposal on how to do just that. We propose the integration of gender-based analysis into sustainability assessment in application to a case study in the Ring of Fire. So this is all probably pretty common knowledge, but the Ring of Fire is a region in Northern Ontario estimated to contain $60 billion worth of minerals. Despite being resource rich, the area specifically focused on in this paper has no historical industrial activity and never had road or rail access. While potentially able to offer multi-generational mining activity, the potential for wealth generation is accompanied by a high chance of significant net negative cumulative effects, particularly for First Nations communities, as we've already discussed. Research demonstrates that current assessment practices are woefully underprepared to anticipate these consequences. So Cole Atkin, the lead researcher on this project, performed a research project in which assessment criteria were developed in collaboration with Abomatong First Nation for application in the Ring of Fire. This project ended in 2019. These criteria utilized generic sustainability indicators, existing academic data, and Abomatong's own perspectives. For this paper, we're building upon Cole's findings to expand those criteria to integrate GBA plus by including gender-specific concerns. The guiding question is, does each criterion specifically influence women, girls, or 2S LGBTQIA plus individuals? The answer is probably. So again, I apologize for the poor visuals, but in this chart we have our general categories and subcategories, the criteria and questions that were co-developed with Abomatong First Nation in order to facilitate a meaningful assessment process. And then in the last column, we added questions specifically related to gender, added to ensure that GBA plus is integrated as a further dimension of impact assessment. So the original objective of this project was to examine the structural forces and practical limitations affecting GBA plus implementation in the impact assessment process and to develop practical outputs to facilitate GBA plus. So the question is, what have we learned? Despite claims of lack of clarity around gender-based analysis plus discussed in our first paper, there is in fact precedence for GBA plus in impact assessment. Further, we find that despite a focus on gender in terms of employment equity or vulnerability, which was another finding from our deep dive into the Senate, the impact of projects on women, girls, and sexual minorities can have far more nuance and complexity. By considering examples of the past and integrating gender considerations into assessment processes that are contextually situated and oriented around sustainability, we have the potential to apply gender-based analysis plus into impact assessment processes that reach beyond lip service into meaningful change and lasting significance. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Holly. I'm going to call on our next speakers to come up and speak to the holistic socioeconomic study for the Webequie Supply Road project. So that's Marianne Tibor McMahon and Leslie Spence.
Great. Thank you. So before we begin our discussion today, we would like to acknowledge that we are meeting on Indigenous land. The land we are meeting on is on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse nations, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Let's go on to the next slide here. So before we begin, we'll just give a little introduction of who we are. So I am Marianne. I'm a social researcher and engagement lead at Indigenous and Community Engagement. I also am the socioeconomic lead for the Webequie Supply Road project. I've been doing these types of studies now for quite some time, about 14 years now, and I have a great passion for socioeconomic studies and research, and it's most importantly collaborating with communities to better understand their interests and their goals as it relates to a project. And I have been so fortunate to have been working alongside Webequie First Nation for the last 4 years on this very important project. I am joined here today by a very good friend and colleague, Leslie Spence from Webequie First Nation.
Hello, bonjour. Manin, Wajie, Webequie Nonji, Nijo Achake Daya. Miguel de Benezo Magaya, Miguel Chke Numa Kaniboya Numa. Ekwa Anishinaabe Mikazwin Ababa said Jinkanago Mingizendodem. Again Demetrogoji Jnikazwin is Leslie Spence. Leslie Jinkanago. So I'm gonna translate that for you guys, and I'm sure you guys want to know what I just said. I'm Leslie Spence. I am a Two-Spirit. I'm from Webequie First Nation. And I work for WSR as a community coordinator and officer liaison. Plus, I have a part-time work with a two-spirit group called NGOs. So that will be on the other discussion. Webequie. Webequie is a fly-in reserve. And Webequie is 500 kilometers from up north of Thunder Bay. And from where we are right now, it is located approximately 1,100 kilometers from here. It's a long ways. There are no year-round access. There's yet, and there's only a seasonal access to go to Webequie, and fly-in reserve. And the only flights that go to is North Star, which is a 1-hour flight from Thunder Bay. Webequie. Webequie translates to shaking your head from side to side. So that really means Webequie. So when you see a duck, it wobbles its head from side to side. So that's where the community got its name from, and we have plenty of ducks in the Meganders. Webequie is a very special place, and from people from outside Webequie, when they come visit there during our summer festival powwows, our summer festival and our summer powwow, they say that Webequie is a very magical place, and it's true. You can see that the evening, the scenery is very beautiful, and it's very magical. Even the northern lights, you can see pretty clearly up there. And so back then, Webequie wasn't recognized as a reserve until 2001. So which was 20 years ago. And they really worked hard to get that reserve, because it wasn't really covered with the provincial park. And Webequie is reclaiming their culture. Reclaiming their culture too. I am reclaiming my my identity too, as a two-spirit person. And so community and values and the three-tier model. So we are being guided by elders guiding principle, which is which we are following the elders guiding principles are being employed throughout the project. So the three-tier model. The three-tier model is a framework for Indigenous consultation, and the core tier, the middle tier, we call that the Darwin, the community tier, and it's that's the first tier, community and overall well-being of the community members. And the second tier, we call that the Jikewen, which really translates to increasing of understanding of Webequie First Nation culture, language, use, traditional cultural activities, ancestral knowledge. This is where we practice our culture, our ways of life, such as hunting, fishing, and ceremonial like sweat lodges and night lodges, etc. And third tier, that's a fundamental tier, which is treaty and partnerships. That third tier we call Pamajuan, which is a business tier. Yeah.
So I'm not going to go into too much detail about the Webequie supply road because Michael had already touched upon that this morning. But I just want to say that, because Webequie, they're the proponents of this environmental assessment project, and also they are community members, impacted by this project. They want to conduct a very thorough environmental assessment because they're going to be using this EA as a decision-making tool for them. They want to understand what those potential impacts are, both on the environment, the socioeconomic environment, and the cultural environment. So as part of this project, we had to develop a very robust engagement plan to engage with Webequie First Nation. And to do that, we had to work very closely with the community to understand the needs and the preferences of the community when engaging. So that means, when we come in for project updates, we go in there, we do a presentation and allow for time for question and answer, and then spend time with the community. For our socioeconomic studies, when we're collecting information, we had to ask community members and Leslie as well, what are the methods that's appropriate to, go into the community and ask them these very, sometimes personal questions. Are they comfortable doing focus groups? Are they comfortable doing interviews? Or do they just want to do a survey? So we had to ask them these questions to see what would work best for their community, because what works best for Webequie may not necessarily work best for another community. And we had to be flexible when engaging with Webequie on the Webequie Supply Road project. This means that, Chief and Council, they're very busy. They have other commitments. Crisis may occur in the community. COVID happens. They have a lot of commitments. So what we did there is we had to take a step back, give Webequie the space for them to deal with these commitments or these crises. And then, Webequie came back to us and said, okay, we're ready to engage and we're ready for you to come in to do your consultation activities or your socioeconomic activities. And this means, we had to respect their engagement protocols and respect their timelines. And of course, COVID was a hurdle. In-person engagements with Webequie was hard. We still wanted to move on with the project, and so we had to come up with creative ways to engage with Webequie. So we did this by doing live streaming events, as you can see here on this picture, where we focused on different topics. We did this bi-weekly. We also did radio shows, which were aired on Wawate Radio for an hour. We even put in a little musical interludes there, but it was tied with questions, but we still got to engage with community members that way. We also conducted virtual open houses as well, where we actually mimicked an open house, a traditional open house style, where you click on the room and then you are able to see project information. But a key part of this engagement success was having representation from the community at all our meetings and through working with Leslie and all our colleagues at Webequie. They were great because they helped us keep the community informed and involved on the project. We learned from Leslie's guidance, especially of who to engage with and when. So when we conducted the socioeconomic baseline study and we were starting the research, we started this with doing our secondary research, our desktop research. But we enhanced this desktop research by community collaboration. We asked community members for their internal reports, if they had anything additional that we couldn't find online, or asking the community for internal information and data that they have on the community that goes beyond the Statistics Canada information. Then what we did was we reviewed that secondary information when we gathered all of that with the community to make sure we understood that information. But then we also engage with them to understand, what they think the gaps are. What other information do they want included in the socioeconomic baseline study? And so from there, we were able to plan our primary research with the community. And we would not have been able to conduct such an in-depth primary research study without the help of Webequie First Nation. Leslie worked hard in helping us identify contacts to make connections. And then when we were in the community, when we talked to those connections, it then snowballed into other connections and contacts. So we were able to just continue, talking to people and getting information. And through our conversations, a lot of Indigenous knowledge was provided to us, so that was helpful as well to inform the baseline study. And so again, we just spent time with the community, kept making those connections and getting information. All right. So the way we collaborated with Webequie meant that this research was truly by the community for the community. This increased the willingness of community members to participate in the study because the community members can see the benefits of the study and participating in the study because they're able to say what their aspirations are. They're able to even tell us, what the social issues are that they're facing in the community. And this is information that you can't get just by doing your desktop research from downtown Toronto. You have to go there, make those connections and relationships with community members. They were heavily involved in our socioeconomic study. We conducted training for them to administer our socioeconomic survey. And when we were developing that survey, it took many, many, many iterations to get that survey right. We reviewed that with the community many times to make sure the language was appropriate, the questions we were asking were appropriate as well. And then once that was done, we trained 6 survey administrators, Leslie included, to administer that survey in community without the project team there. And they collected over 200 socioeconomic survey responses. GBA Plus was also incorporated throughout the study, and it was also spearheaded by the community. Leslie is always reminding us, engage with the youth, engage with the elders, engage with women, and that's what we did. Just in the summer, we had a focus group with women, and it was very well received. It was the first focus group for all women, mothers, non-mothers, young women as well. And they appreciated that we were taking the time to speak with them to gain their perspectives and insights to include in this baseline study. In the end, community readiness is improved by working in a very collaborative way. As I mentioned, community members are involved in the process and they understand the need for this information so that they can conduct a thorough assessment. But it also allows them to understand the pathways of opportunities for when that EA is approved. The socioeconomic study is not just a study to assess those potential impacts. It leads the way for the community readiness. So when we're in this process here now for doing the socioeconomic studies, we're able to better understand how to enhance those benefits and mitigate those risks. We're talking to them, if these opportunities come on board, how is it that you want to be ready? We're trying to figure out, the skills, creating that database for Webequie so that way they can then, be ready for construction opportunities. We are gathering information and data, not only how ready community members are for economic benefits, but how they want to be involved going forward and what their aspirations are of the community. Want to add anything? No?
You're good. So the far north is changing, and we need to start thinking about to work together. Especially putting Indigenous peoples on board, especially working on a project to include women, elders, and youth. If you want to work. And to have a shared understanding of what the collaboration means to Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people. So collaboration in our community means it's Indigenous-led through engagement, through primary and secondary research to understand baseline conditions and community readiness to prepare our youth and prepare our children and prepare ourselves, you know, because the Ring of Fire is gonna have that impact on us, and we need to work together and have that readiness. The Ring of Fire, that rock, it needs to have a purpose too, you know. That rock needs to have purpose to carry us on the next seventh generation. No, we gotta look after our kids, our children. WSR is an example of a collaboration. Working together in the Anishinaabe means mamon kiwen. Je mamon kiwing. Je mamo Ushitchigaying, to build together, to build that relationship to. Yeah, that's it for me.
That's it. That's all we had. Thank you.
Thank you, Marion, and thank you, Leslie. And Leslie, thanks for those concluding remarks. It certainly gives us an opportunity to reflect and think on some of those remarks as we move through the presentations for some questions. So our next presentation is with Sarah and Shayna. Shayna is going to be virtual, and I had two people that I was supposed to ask how to pronounce their names, and Sarah, I forgot to ask you that, so I apologize. I'll let you correct me when you get up here. So please welcome Sarah and Shayna.
Thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Blair, for facilitating our session. So my name is Sarah Dugnan, and my colleague is Shayna Segal. Shayna is unfortunately not able to join us in person today, which is unfortunate for you all because her quick wit is far superior to mine. Shayna and I both work in the Lovely Human Environment Group as part of WSP, formerly Wood. And so we're here talking today about engaging Indigenous and Western knowledge systems through socioeconomic baseline development. Shayna and myself are both from academic backgrounds, so we have worked with different Indigenous nations and peoples across the world for over 10 years collectively. And what we share today is going to be primarily tips and tools that we've kind of gathered as settlers working with Indigenous nations and peoples, and how this can kind of apply into socioeconomic baselines as well. Okay, got it upside down, so that's a good start. All right, so again, just as kind of a background, for us as researchers, we come understanding that we're settlers, and so when we work with Indigenous nations, we understand that we have a very different paradigm and different way of viewing things, so we're always here to listen and to take the knowledge and advice given to us by our Indigenous collaborators. So today we'll be going through kind of a few key arguments, and then looking at the Impact Assessment Act from 2019 and how that's really shifted how we can work with Indigenous nations on projects, and then kind of going through, again, some of the collaborative tools and methods that can work within that as well. So the three kind of main arguments that we would like to make within this is that when engaging and working with Indigenous nations, it's always important to have culturally appropriate engagement. So a lot of the information that's required for these baseline assessments that we work on don't always manifest in the shapes that the projects and the clients want. So, again, we're coming from very Western knowledge systems, and so we're on very clear linear deadlines, and that isn't always the way that it looks when working with different Indigenous communities. So what we work through is aligning the different perspectives, the different needs and interests and intentions in a more holistic, engaged way. We also work on flexible knowledge gathering. So this has been something that's been mentioned previously in this session and prior, that, respecting Indigenous knowledge is really key to being able to be flexible within these projects. And understanding that Indigenous knowledge varies by nation, by group, and it's very deeply local, allows us to understand, or begin to understand at least, the relationships between land, Indigenous knowledge, and culture, and to figure out ways that we can gather knowledge together that best reflects this and respects this knowledge without also, mining it in inappropriate ways. And then we also recognize that representation and capacity levels really do matter with this. So in conversations with Indigenous nations, we are very quick to address the levels of capacity versus desired interest that groups may have, and who within the community may be best positioned to identify certain concerns and priorities. Often you're speaking with one particular group from the community, so having those open conversations and making sure that you're able to discuss, who might actually be the best person to talk about, local midwifery and things like that. So looking through kind of a shift from the 2012 Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, so that was focused primarily on this duty to consult Indigenous nations. And Shaina and myself have been fortunate to have started consulting only in the past little while. So one of the projects that we both work on is under the new Impact Assessment Act from 2019. And through this, we have a much more nuanced approach to valuing and including Indigenous knowledge in projects, Indigenous rights and treaty rights, as well as self-governance. So this is a really profound opportunity to be able to bring more collaborative and reciprocal relationships into environmental projects. The other two things that we wanted to kind of note that work within the advances of the Impact Assessment Act as well is by 2021, Canada had officially adopted UNDRIP, which is the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And this is a really strong document worked on by Indigenous peoples worldwide to provide this roadmap of how we can have lasting reconciliation as well as cooperative relationships between settlers and Indigenous peoples. And then in 2022, new environmental projects have started to become affected by all of these policies, adoptions, and this legal recognition of the Indigenous rights that should have been recognized the entire time. So these projects we use as case studies are some of the first to work under these, as well as the Climate Change Canada release of the Indigenous Knowledge Policy Framework. So when we work with our clients and Indigenous nations, we work a lot within the context of understanding and learning about Indigenous knowledge. So we offer these definitions as how we understand them working within a corporate setting, but then also wanted to just kind of engage how we're going to speak about them throughout the rest of the presentation. So within Indigenous knowledge, that's not a universal or static or complex or static understanding of the world. It's very complex, nuanced, and culturally bound. It can be attached to landscapes, and it can evolve through time with communities. Traditional knowledge is a bit of a broader category that sometimes gets used as well, which includes Indigenous knowledge, and is created by any individual or group and kind of carried through generations. And so this also tends to be associated with the landscape and environment, but distinctions are also important to kind of respect the differences between these two forms. And then we use Western knowledge within this presentation to kind of capture the understanding of like settler knowledge systems based on these measurements and this quantification and that idea of like objectivist rational truths as well. So when we use that, that's kind of what we're referring to throughout this. So Indigenous knowledge, when you look at the impact assessment studies and the language within those documents, it's understood a little bit differently as well. Because the land and the relationship to the natural world is central, Indigenous knowledge is inherently connected to different and diverse Indigenous cultures and identities and traditions, as well as self-determination of Indigenous governance and sovereignty movements as well. So bringing that into the impact assessment, it's important to understand that these are deeply rooted historical and contemporary relationships between Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous peoples and landscapes. And this allows us to have a much more respectful approach to knowledge gathering together, especially understanding and working through the historical components of the Indian Act and things like that that would also be informing and impacting the impact assessment studies. So we wanted to talk a little bit about engaging with Indigenous nations kind of theoretically versus practice as well. So, typically as consultants, we have these classic tools of the trade that we rely on. So these can be surveys, these can be desktop research, as well as census data. And again, these are very, very Western metrics of looking at human populations. I'm an anthropologist by trade, so I always like to kind of think about that self-reflexivity within that. And this really relies on this quantitative metric of a community or a group of people. And so these aren't necessarily always best matched to fit the Indigenous nations that we work with, as has been discussed today as well. So there are more culturally appropriate tools, and it's a matter of having those conversations of seeing, what actually works for this community. What are you interested in gathering knowledge on? And how can we do this in a way that, works for the project requirements, but then also, and more importantly, is also useful for the communities themselves. So these can be, stories and storytelling as knowledge in itself, ceremonies, guided walks, and then also, understanding qualitative and lived experiences as knowledge in their own right. These aren't things that are rooted in metrics. They might not necessarily translate the way that you would expect to for baseline studies, but again, really start to build this much more comprehensive picture that allows for more nuance in baseline studies than census data would necessarily allow. The other thing within all of this is that knowledge storing or storing knowledge can be a very static process. We think about all these giant Excel files that we have. They're very, columnar and organized, and it stays in this constant place. When you're sharing and learning knowledge from different Indigenous nations, storytelling is a much more fluid and adaptable way of conveying information that changes as the land changes and as connections grow and are established in different areas. The landscape itself is also this really important repository of knowledge. And so working on the land and being able to discuss and share experiences allows for a different form of knowledge to start to arise as well. And again, through the 2019 Impact Assessment Act, being able to have these more fluid and different kind of tools allows for meeting some of these new requirements that I think a lot of people are still trying to kind of figure out how you go about doing those as well. So I think the biggest thing that we always like to pause and reflect on is that the information that you need is not always going to be the information that is given, and that's okay. I worked primarily with Haudenosaunee peoples, and so I like to come back to that idea of the two-row wampum belt agreement, where you have Western and Indigenous communities paddling on their own path in the river, not interfering with each other's governance, but able to support each other when needed. So through that, we're also working on different timelines, different capacities, different interests. And so how we understand time is also very different, and being conducive to those conversations allows for a much more respectful relationship as these relationships progress over the years. The information that you want as a researcher or a consultant, isn't necessarily readily available. A lot of it comes in building relationships, understanding that these are long-term periods of engagement and relationship building and trust building, and that knowledge can come through that, but that it's not necessarily owed to you as a consultant coming in. Excuse me. Knowledge is also diffused in various realms, so I kind of spoken to that earlier as well, where making sure that you're expanding and being able to talk to other people in the community that are best representative of the certain information or knowledge that you're interested in learning about. And we use these sort of pillars, as we call them, or holistic pillars of social, health and well-being, environment and economic pillars as these holistic and interconnected forms. So while they have their separate requirements within the OAIA Act and through tailored impact statement guidelines, they're also so deeply connected. So understanding that these things can weave together and that you can have those conversations about knowledge and how they're related. Our responsibility to our relationships is to align these research pillars with the constructions of project impact. So that's our, we kind of position ourselves as that, knowing that these are pillars that interconnect, but that ultimately we have to translate this in a way that works for project requirements and client needs for that. So some of the different ways of tools and different ways of doing and gathering knowledge and information come, again, from these sorts of different understandings of knowledge. So we have meetings, surveys, and focus groups and comment forums from the very Western approach, but having conversations about, well, what's the intention behind the questions that we're asking in these meetings? Or how do you want to ask a survey question that meets some of the interests that you have for understanding your own community, and how can that also align with the project as well? So being flexible and shifting how questions are asked, what questions are good questions, what questions are bad questions, and having conversations about, how do you prefer to work through this? How does your mind work, and how can we make sure that we're working in a way that is respectful of that? Through traditional knowledge, there's also, key informant interviews, integrative mapping on the land. So again, sharing information through the land itself, and being able to map in ways that are not invasive of traditional knowledge and gathering, but also able to tell that story through a map rather than 2 or 3 pages of text, as well as participant observation. And then with Indigenous knowledge itself, different tools that can be used as community meetings, elder teas, community feasts, and paddles and walks. Again, kind of reestablishing different ways of approaching the questions that we would like to ask. So some of the guiding principles that we have with this is to understand and respect the levels of capacities and how they vary between nations that we might work with, different levels of expertise and interest in the project, and catering to those differing needs and capacities and interests. And to be really upfront and honest. I think the biggest part of building relationships is, understanding, well, what is your actual preference for engagement? What is your preference for the amount of time or leeway that we give in sharing with community or, creating meetings, as well as different protocols like that. And then through it, also recognizing that the OCAP principles of ownership, control, access, and possession for First Nations, or appropriate alternatives for Inuit or Métis peoples as well, through the data. So having conversations about data ownership and storage and what that looks like, as well as synergy and information for gathering for community benefit. So some of the main takeaways that I just wanted to leave you with. So again, with this recent change to baseline requirements through the Impact Assessment Act, there are really big new opportunities to engage and to create these more inclusive and collaborative research works with Indigenous peoples and nations. And these can be really holistic and interconnected. Again, even if you see the very linear kind of bullet forms on the tailored impact statement guidelines, you can make those much more dynamic and holistic and bring approaches that understand how land and health and economics and sociocultural factors interconnect, because they don't exist in real life in those silos that they do on the documents. Ensuring that we have culturally appropriate engagement. So shaping information, or the shape of the information will not always reflect the shape of the project. So how can we work to align those interests? Flexibility for knowledge gathering is huge. Again, understanding the timelines might differ, capacities might differ, but interests also are important. This process is really new, and so it leaves us space to explore and better understand how to respect Indigenous knowledge and gather the most appropriate information to reflect these changes. And again, understanding and appreciating capacity and interests are going to be different from nation to nation, as well as from project to project. Recognizing what a nation's or community's interest is versus their capacity is the best to understand how to engage further as well. We had originally planned to have a discussion because we thought it was going to be a little bit of a smaller group, but I can also save those for the questions as well. That's all I have. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks very much, Sarah. The last one in this session is on GBA plus analysis in socioeconomic baseline studies, and it's with Leanna and Nathan. Please welcome Leanna and Nathan.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. I actually just wanted to start with a moment of gratitude. We're talking at a very high level about gender-based analysis today. We're talking about best practices, some lessons learned from projects. But there's been some talented speakers and some very insightful questions already asked. So I encourage that. I want this to be as interactive as possible. I really hope there are some questions towards the end. So please try to take notes as you can as we go through our material. But I actually just wanted to do a couple shout outs to FISA earlier, Alexandra, and the CRGBA Plus. Really, really insightful. It provides us an opportunity to bookend gender-based analysis in a meaningful way. And then also a moment ago, Holly, for diving into the material that we're going to be talking about at a high level and a lot more of a granular level, which is a benefit. And then for us, it just provides a little bit more context. We're going to be talking about best practices today. And providing a couple pieces towards the end that Leanna is going to be taking over that are going to be diving into findings from a study that we're conducting. So we're going to try to keep things as generic as possible to make it as universal and applicable as possible in everybody's work. But if you do have questions towards the end, certainly open to that. So 3 key takeaways. What is gender-based analysis exactly? Why is it important? Best practices applying GBA. And findings from our study. So what we're trying to do today is talk about reconciling expectations and good research practice. So incorporating gender-based analysis while also making sure that the end audience is as universal as possible, while also following sound methodological practices, and just remaining understandable to both clients, communities that we're working with, meeting expectations, meeting regulatory requirements. There's quite a few different loopholes to jump through and something that's supposed to be at the end of the day really meaningful to the person. So while trying to be meaningful to the person, we're jumping through all of those hoops to really make this meaningful at the end of the day. And this is not a one-size-fits-all approach. And I think that's going to be really important. And I think that if anything's been shared so far and all these nuances related to the projects we've talked about today, gender-based analysis, I think, is a perfect example of how by trying to take an out-of-the-box product and applying it to every project that everyone works on, it simply won't work. You're taking a square peg and trying to put it in a round hole. And trying to be understanding of the communities that you're working with and listening to them and integrating what's being requested as opposed to coming to them with recommendations and suggestions, unless that's asked for. And then lastly, gender-based analysis plus in practice. So leveraging Canadian data sets, identifying the local context, illustrating how projects may actually be impacted by GBA elements, and then making sure that we're not applying our own inherent research bias. Leanna and I are both social science researchers by trade. With that, we also have to identify that when we approach any new project, we're approaching that project through a lens that's pre-constructed based on academic and life experiences that may not apply to the communities that we're working on and the projects that we're working on. So I think there's been some really good explanations of what gender-based analysis is, so I'm not going to try to redo what's been better done by previous speakers. But at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is examine the intersectional relationships between a variety of different groups, be it gender, age, ethnicity, race, religion, legal status, socioeconomic status, and how these actually inform access to resources, activities, and any constraints individuals themselves or the communities they represent face relative to one another in a particular context. What I mean by context in this case is probably project specific. So identifying the various roles played by people in their households, communities, workplaces, political processes, and the general economy. And these different roles often result in women and non-binary people having less access to and control over the resources that, in some cases, some projects are specific towards. Less participation and influence in decision-making processes, and a greater perceived risk related to their own intersecting identities. And I think that, again, has been spoken about in detail in previous presentations. And I think that's maybe something that we can take a moment to kind of pause on and reflect. That at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is open as many doors as possible, where OAIA 2012 standards tended to just be a duty of consult. We know what the limitations of that are. Thank you again to FISA for presenting a little bit of that and what still needs to be done here in Ontario, and I think that's really important. And then lastly, not exclusively talking just about women and girls or specific to solely gendered issues, but the engagement of how gender and intersecting identities actually inform experiences and perceptions of risk. So we were talking about before when we were trying to plan our idea for this presentation, this is months ago now, and trying to make this as tangible as possible, where we're talking about our responsibility as consultants to balance things like client expectations. At the end of the day, it's all well and good to come to the table with a bunch of preconceived structures and methods that you know would be useful and applicable to projects. We still have to make sure that that meets budgetary requirements. So we have to make sure that the client understands that approach and what the value of that might actually look like. So information needs to be understandable to clients and focused on the impacts of the project that they may have on underserved or equity deserving groups. This also applies to regulatory bodies. We have to make sure that the information we're sharing makes sense to everyone that's looking at it. Community needs. I'm probably going to underscore this as obviously the most important element of gender-based analysis practice as it applies to, in our case, largely natural resource projects. But identifying the demographics of the community and the issues faced by the underserved groups within it. So we're going to be talking a little bit today about participatory action research methods, but that's actually already been done. Marion did an excellent example, and Leslie presented an excellent example of this in practice, which is fantastic. Again, we're a nice bookend to what's already been shared. And then basically asking communities, what is it that we need to know about your community, the composition of your community, the needs within your community? Please tell us so that we might be able to then take that information and explore it with you in a collaborative model to make sure at the end of the day, this is as valuable for everyone as possible. And then researchers' understanding. So I just made a comment towards this, but we come into this, any researcher, doesn't matter who you talk to, comes into these projects with a preconceived bias. Being able to check that immediately, understand it and recognize it immediately means that it's hopefully going to be a better quality product in the end. So understanding and reconciling our own research biases going into these things and incorporating how these biases may turn out in secondary research that we're conducting by focusing us before we even start, and then maybe even spilling over into our primary research process. So we've talked about a couple different examples of how that takes place. So that could be either key informant interviews, focus groups, community consultation events, and a variety of other methods. And lastly, the regulatory process. So incorporation of GBA plus requirements. Again, that's that more rigid framework that exists, but I think Holly did a great job pointing out, well, there's already some limitations. There's already some barriers associated with gender-based analysis plus an action as it relates to IAs. How do we kind of extrapolate the meaningful pieces of that and apply it to our work? But at the end of the day, still meeting IA requirements. So why is it that this is important for socioeconomic baselines? Thankfully, Sarah just went over, a colleague of mine, Sarah just went over the socioeconomic research practices and exactly how WSP actually approaches these issues. But at the end of the day, they're important because A, they follow Federal Impact Assessment Act requirements, so it's legally a mandate. It's needed to identify the experiences of individuals based on their intersecting identities, which has historically not been done and not well represented in any work. Provide voices to equity deserving groups within the study area, regional study area, project study area. Again, extrapolating how that might differ between kind of the concentration of the project site. And then understanding the holistic impact the project may actually have on different members within a population. And doing so in a meaningful way that's been fed by the individuals being represented as opposed to top down. Best practices. This is so funny because we just went through this being a nightmare scenario where your presentation dies. And I mentioned that this is going to be a good exercise if this ever happens to us. Thankfully, I've gone through it before. I've talked about, while this is getting back on track, I've talked about, oh, so I've lost control again. So I've talked about best practices and I've talked about the application of this work and what it means. I can't emphasize enough how in this presentation, Leanna's about to take over and talk about a few different things, but the one size fits all approach does not work here. And every project needs to be approached in a meaningful and mindful way so that we can understand the community needs that's actually informed by the community in early conversations. There's been a couple presentations that focused already on how far upstream in a project is too soon to start meaningful collaboration with a region, with a community, with a First Nation, and it's never too soon. We talk about barriers to participation. We talk about what does collaboration actually mean, meaningful collaboration. And I think that's kind of defined here in the same way gender-based analysis is, which is if we're doing a significant job or an appropriate, this is completely dead. Nothing. Maybe we can skip ahead a couple slides. There you go. I'll give that to you to take over. Yep. And maybe if we can do that in a way that we understand that the community's voice helps shape exactly what the parameters of the gender-based context might look like, that's where we can make sure that we're not just simply saying, okay, we've checked the box for age, we've checked the box for gender, we've checked the box for this intersecting group. That's not meaningful. What's meaningful is making the research appropriate to the group we're talking to. One more slide ahead. Perfect, thank you. So applying GBA plus to socioeconomic baseline. So I've just talked a little bit about our experience, and this is what this is fed into. Everything that we're sharing today is best practice based on my experience in the field, Leanna's experience in the field, and in relation specifically to mining projects for us in Northern Ontario. So this is actually both Northeastern and Northwestern Ontario. Taking a look at population identities, indigeneity, gender, age, socioeconomic status, and geographic location. And use existing frameworks for socioeconomic baselines to identify areas that may pose a risk to equity-deserving groups. And this is historical, and this is based on Health Canada's social determinants of health, which we internally have expanded to be a little bit more granular. But we've included a couple different categories there, which I won't read out right now. But for those at home that are tuning in or at work tuning in, certainly encourage you to look at it. Because Leanna's about to talk about gender-based violence or intimate partner violence, and how that is a unique way to approach the work that we do. And leverage publicly available data from national, provincial, and local levels. So using Statistics Canada data, provincial data, academic articles, and municipal reports to, again, ensure that we're looking at this through a lens where once the community's informed us of these specific vulnerable groups, self-identified vulnerable groups, we can then take a look at those data sets to say, how does this make sense? How are we doing this well? Why is this meaningful? And what is the end result for both regulatory purposes, but also community purposes? So I'll pass things over along to Leanna to give you a couple examples. Thank you.
All right. Okay. So we want to be able to provide you folks with a step-by-step process that we've used when applying this GBA into our socioeconomic baseline. But again, this is not a one-size-fits-all approach. It's also not as linear as we're making it seem on this slide. It's definitely like identifying gaps is something that we have to use throughout all of the steps and so on. So this is just a general process that we use. And I'll be using the example of intimate partner violence to lay this out for you. So for step one, we're going to leverage Canadian-wide data representing the disproportionate impacts of a population group. So in this case, Indigenous women to a risk. So in this case, intimate partner violence. Step two is to narrow that down to look at the regional statistics to identify the local context of that issue. And then you're going to identify the gaps in data, or whether that be in community resources or so on. And for example, in smaller municipalities in Northern Ontario, publicly available data is not always available, especially when it comes to risks such as intimate partner violence. And then we're going to look at the community resources within that area to see if there's any kind of resources that would help alleviate the issue or maybe exacerbate the issue. And in this case, we look to see if there's any domestic violence shelters in Red Lake. And then lastly, we connected this to the project to see how the project's workforce might be impacted by this risk. And we asked a couple questions. So we asked how this issue may impact the female workforce in a male-dominant industry such as mining. And does this risk having an equitable and healthy workforce? And then we also looked to see if there's any developments of safety and training programs designed to address and understand intimate partner violence and its impact on health and safety. So to give you
a more concrete example of some of the findings that we have in our socioeconomic baseline so far. So the first one, we looked at the comparison of mining and sexual harassment within Red Lake and Kenora District. And we found a study from 2011 that showed that mining was the industry where women faced the highest risk of sexual harassment, with a rate of 72 reports per 100,000 workers. And research has also indicated that the risk of sexual harassment has limited participation rates of women within these industries. So looking at Red Lake, we found that 165 individuals who identified as females in Red Lake worked in mining in 2016, so from Statistics Canada, and this made up 14.5% of the total female labor force. So there is possibly a risk of that sexual harassment in this industry may discourage higher participation rates of women within this industry. But this is not experienced homogenously throughout all women. For example, immigrant workers, who make up a large proportion of the mineral sector in Canada, can face a distinct obstacle in reporting through potential language barriers and also possibly unfamiliarity with rights and laws against sexual harassment. Another example we have is looking at childcare and its impact on the female labor force. So looking at the cost of childcare within Ontario, we found a study that showed that in 2018, the average cost of childcare was $11,500 per child per year. Then looking at Red Lake and the average income earner in that area, we found that the average income earner would have to spend 15% of their income on childcare per year per child. And then we also looked at the community resources in that area to see if that would impact the accessibility of childcare. And we found that there was 3 childcare services in Red Lake with a limited supply of subsidies. So this combination of affordability and accessibility of childcare may disproportionately affect women, as we found a study that showed that women's work hours decreased more than men with the presence of a child in the household, and I believe that was 2 times more, something around there. So looking at these 2 examples, you can really see that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. It really depends on the data that's available, the type of population that we're looking at, the type of issue we're looking at. So that goes back to one of our key takeaways. Also going back to reconciling expectations in good research practice. So with these examples, we made sure to connect this to what the client's expectations and their needs, and making sure this is understandable to the project that we're working on. And then lastly, looking at GBA in practice. So the examples that I showed you, also looking at that step-by-step process for intimate partner violence. So yeah, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. It's not a linear process, but it's something that we're trying to learn as we go. And we're really excited to be able to start primary research as well, to be able to fill those gaps that we're currently looking at in terms of the desktop research. And that's it.
Thank you very much. Okay, excellent. If we can turn the lights up, that'd be great. So thanks again for the presenters here today. We've got about 15 minutes for any questions. If there's any folks who'd like to come up to the mic, or if there's any online. I guess I'll ask one to try to kick things off here, but perhaps and open to anybody on the panel. How far behind or ahead, but I think it's the former, how far behind are we in Canada and or Ontario with respect to the application of GBA plus in our environmental assessments? In comparison to, I'm assuming that there's other leading jurisdictions that you've leaned on as you've done research and looked at as examples. Unless we're the shining example and we're the first ones to the game.
Hello?
Both mics. Gotcha. Copy that.
So I can give you at least my answer, so I want to make it clear that this isn't a comprehensive one. But I know as far as Canada is concerned, obviously the Impact Assessment Act was a huge step forward based on CA 2012 duty to consult standards. So I'll start by saying that about the Canadian ecosystem. I would say that other international examples of communities that are doing it well right now, probably leading would be New Zealand and the integration of their colonialist government with Indigenous communities and worldviews and their political and autonomous systems. There's a lot of really good quality work coming out of New Zealand that I've personally modeled some of my work after. And then second to that, I know that Australia is making some very significant headway in the last probably 10 to 15 years in terms of reconciliatory practices. Canada, I would say, is significantly behind both of those. But I don't want that to be dismissive. I think we've made fairly significant improvements and gains, but I mean, far from perfect. And I think Alexandra's culturally relevant GBA plus practices, great example of that evolution in practice. And I'm excited to actually see that research. We were talking about it a minute ago. So there's still lots of room for gains, but yeah, that's where I think we sit.
Question at the mic.
So I just wanted to say, like, I appreciate everyone's work with Indigenous inclusion. I'm just seeing a lot of the conversation on engagement, and I'm not really seeing or hearing much about the processes of inclusion, like, joint equity, revenue sharing, because we know all of this always takes no revenue. So I just wanted to know where we're at in terms of IBAs. We're not talking about that very much, and this is not in work, but I also sit on a meeting on committee for my community, and we deal with a plethora of proponents. And for example, one proponent had given us some money for the mitigation process.
Yeah, and thanks for the comment. If anyone on the panel wants to discuss that, but we are always on the planning committee. We are always looking for ideas for next conference. So let's discuss afterwards. Certainly.
It's also really important to do this generation that our kind of growth from our youth is kind of so I think that's really important for this conference.
Yeah. Thank you for the comment. And the other?
I think that's a very valuable recommendation. In fact, I think next year having potentially one of the clients that we work with co-present with us, I think would help share a little bit about that. We're not privy to what exactly is included in IBA agreements or impact benefit agreements. So for us, even our hands are tied to a certain extent. We have a bunch of recommendations on how that could potentially be done well or better than it currently is based on kind of legal standards, just based on what we've seen. So even your feedback right there is there's a certain limited voice being represented today, and I think that's really astute. It's a good observation, coupled with the fact that I think there's, again, lots of room for improvement in how those negotiations transpire and to what degree and how early they should start versus when they actually do start. I think there's a bit of a gap that needs to be closed there. So that's all I was going to say. It's a great question. I think that would be my recommendation for next year's having more clients be able to speak to the IBA component. Thank you.
Yeah,
sure.
Thank you all for that presentation. That's great. Leslie reminded me of something that isn't really captured in any of these discussions in terms of best practices, and that is particularly around Indigenous knowledge systems, language. I don't know how many of you are Cree speakers, how many of you understand Cree or languages, language
languages. That's where that relationship is actually reflected, and it's really challenging, I think, to just as a colonial, as a settler, as a scientist, to be looking at others and trying to document what we think others are doing. So I'm interested in how social science actually considers those ideas. And then I just want to flag, like, some of these words are really triggering. Gender-based analysis is really interesting because lots of people in this room are affected by this violence and these things. And so I'm intrigued too about your trauma-informed approaches and what kind of training you bring into these systems and places with respect to the social science.
I can attempt to. So I think the last part of your comment there, Cheryl, was on any training with respect to trauma-based assessment as it relates to the gender-based plus. And sorry, and Indigenous languages as well. Anyone care to field that one?
Can answer a question about languages. Am I supposed to use two mics? As for languages, as for me, I don't know how to write my language, which is which we call syllabics. AEUA, Sesisus Lelilula of the syllabics. My grandfather tells me that language is very, very important for our people, and that our language is very complex when we try to describe something, even trying to translate into a technical term like gender-based analysis, like that technical term. We have to describe it, and and also what I'm doing with language personally, because our language is dying across Canada, and personally, I would record my grandfather wherever he goes meetings, especially when he's on the radio. I hit the record button so I can capture his knowledge and wisdom, so I can carry that, and I can pass that on to my niece, my nephew, my godchildren, and our language is very important, and it's dying, and that that I'm trying to capture a recording of my grandfather. That's it.
Thanks, Les. Other question at the mic?
Sure. Kathy, we raised our touch. I just wanted to say thank you for the thoughtful presentations. I appreciate the difficulty in trying to examine how gender-based analysis must apply in practical terms. And I appreciate the comments about one size fits all, not necessarily being applicable. I'm wondering if any of the analysts could share some stories, or a story, where you see positive outcomes coming from the work that you're doing, and welcome any of the panelists to share.
Yeah, so for those online, the question was any stories to share with a positive outcome from your experiences?
I'm happy to volunteer from the.
Any takers?
Hi, I
can speak from the Webequie project. I think just us, sorry, there's two mics here. It's a little daunting having these two here. I think the whole experience, just us conducting the socioeconomic survey collaboratively with Webequie Supply Road is a positive outcome in itself because they are very involved. And because, they want to be able to, maximize those opportunities for when the EA is approved, and they want to be ready for construction. So it's very important for them, and it's positive that way. Every time we see a community member, and Leslie, they'll ask us, when are you coming back to the community again? When are you going to come spend time with us? What other activities are you doing? We're not done our study yet, but they now know the process and how important their voice is in informing the socioeconomic study, that they're looking forward to those opportunities.
Sorry? Oh, Cole's going to speak? Okay.
Hi,
Cole,
guys. Sorry.
Go right ahead.
Sorry, I'm in the virtual space, so it's a bit odd. And thank you guys for providing an opportunity for someone with COVID to participate. And thanks to everybody. It was a great session for learning, and I really enjoyed it. I wanted to say that I think that this has been highlighted by all the speakers, that I think that even just providing the opportunity to have dialogues about gender and implications of projects and undertakings about gender is a contribution to a community that may not have been anticipated. I've done work where I've had teas with women in communities and to ask them the implications of, say, a mining project on their community. And the conversation is, well, we've never had a chance to have that conversation. And that's a really dynamic moment, right? Because it can change the direction of where something's going. To be able to even just say, I'd never been able to talk about the implications that this has on myself and my family and my work opportunities and all of those things. So that's something I wanted to highlight. And another thing is, there was a question about trauma-based discussions, and I think that one of the other things, particularly when working with Indigenous communities, as has also been so clearly demonstrated, is to take the lead of those elders that you're so lucky to work with. We did an online workshop. Actually, Nedia did one, and Mary Boyden presented, and she brought an elder from her community online on a different Zoom stream because the conversation had the potential to be triggering to people. So that people, if they felt like they needed to talk to someone, had this opportunity to engage with someone from their community directly, or someone that was able to talk about a lived experience in a similar way, even if it wasn't in the same community, because in this virtual space, it becomes different. So I just think that we're in this precipice of a new age on GBA, right? We're entering this new era of something new and exciting, even though we have done gender analysis, as Holly so eloquently identified, but we're taking it much more seriously. And I think that this workshop's demonstrating that, but we have this opportunity to work with people who haven't had that opportunity before. So anyways, suffice to say, lots of excitement. And I think that that's one of the benefits, is that we have this opportunity to have voices and opportunity to use new approaches that we've never gotten to do before that will change the pathway.
Yeah, thanks, Cole. It's a great way to sum up this session. Just want to say thanks again to the panel members for sharing your stories, your experiences, and your research. I know I certainly learned quite a bit through this session. So let's give a round of applause for our panels. And we've got about a 15-minute break now, so we'll start back up for the last session of the day at 3:15. Thanks, everyone.